brief history of the media. Shadow puppetry is considered to be the oldest form of puppetry in the world. It's said to have originated in China around 2nd century BC during the Han Dynasty. And so the little fable that they said for how it came about was that the emperor was very sad and his heart was broken. So his closest advisor had come up with these shadow puppets. And the first play, supposedly, him was the emperor as a shadow puppet, being in all his glory, all his great deeds. There's very little evidence to it, but that is the folktale of how it arose. And so shows often brought fables to life like these, and they're based around themes of good versus evil, and often satirical and riddled with comedy. And shadow plays are much more intricate than the simple hand gestures you think about in front of the lights, like the dogs and the bats and everything. So they're very, very intricate, as you can see from these pictures here, that put many hours into cutting out these shapes to make sure they're perfect.
Alright, so an example of puppetry is Japanese wayang kulit, and it's originated in the Indonesian islands, specifically Java. And they're handmade leather puppets, and they're painted with wood paint, and then they're made with perforations with a hammer and a little chisel kind of thing, so that the color can be seen as they're performing. And then the shows are based on classical literature, like the Indian Ramayana, and they're accompanied by gamelan, which is a traditional Indonesian orchestra with xylophones, marimbas, drums, things like that. And then they're usually all night long, so they'd start at 9 p.m. and then go until the morning. And they're usually accessories to celebrations, such as political campaigns, weddings, and the viewers were not expected to sit down like you would be at a Western play or theater. They could get up, socialize. There were vendors, you could buy things. It was a huge community event. And so people could also walk on either side of the puppet show so they could see what was going on behind with the Delong, which is the puppet master, and he or she did all of the manipulation of the puppets, and so you can see both sides, which is great. Another example is Ottoman Shadow Theater, which is called Karagöz, who's the main character in all of the plays, and they're usually based around Karagöz and his friend. And so Karagöz is supposed to be kind of like a commoner, and his friend is more intellectual. So so a lot of it's based on misunderstandings between the conversations. They were for all classes and peoples. They're often satirical, and a lot of people say it's the beginning of cinema in Turkey and animation. So that's kind of the modern connection of this dead medium. They were also made from thin leather with perforations so that the color could be seen from in front of the screen. And the characters were based on ethnic stereotypes, with also fantastical creatures like jinn, which are genies kind of, and witches.
So as we mentioned before, it's pretty widely believed that shadow puppetry began in China, although it's highly debated when. Most people believe it was in the Western Han area, which was the 2nd century BC, but the other commonly believed time was the 11th century AD, so it's a pretty big difference. When shadow theater began to gain popularity in China, it initially started in the cities and then spread to more rural parts of China. Now it's integrated into the culture all over the country. And then, so during the 1800s, one of the first indications that shadow puppetry was highly linked to the social and cultural situation at the time. There was a lot of unrest in the country, and the popularity of shadow puppetry declined significantly, and as well as in the Cultural Revolution and during the urbanization of China, it left shadow puppetry as more of a commercial attraction for tourists where they sell shadow puppets, and not many shadow theaters still currently exist. These pictures are interesting because it shows how different shadow puppets can be made. On the far right, the more colorful one is a machine-made shadow puppet, and in the middle is a hand-cut shadow puppet. You can see how, surprisingly, the machine-made one is much less accurate and a bit more messy, and which shows the left too is also hand-cut. It shows how much time and how important shadow puppetry was and how accurate and complex many of the shadow puppets could be. Many of them had moving parts and different colors, as we mentioned before.
So modern shadow puppetry, believe it or not, it still continues into modern day theater. It's much less popular, but with recent technological advances in theater and lighting specifically, they're able to create fantastic shows with the new technology. Often they're live action shows where actresses and actors will utilize their bodies and props to cast shadows on the wall behind them, and which will aid to their live performance. And there's very many ways you can go about this, which will be shown in the next slide. But there will often be a performance going on in visible light while shadows on the wall behind them are either echoing the performance by amplifying it in shadow form, or sometimes telling a completely different story depending on how the light is used and how technology and angles are positioned. So here, the 4 pictures are actually like modern day shows that you can see that travel around the world, which are really like utilizing modern day technology with this more ancient art form. So in the top left, we see that shadow puppets are used as like a background for this performance going on. In the top right, it's a little hard to see, but actors and actresses are in the front dancing, and their shadows are behind them, almost in a like larger than life fashion, amplifying their show. In the bottom left, we see wire being used for the faces, and it's really playing with like the thickness of shadows and kind of the lucidity, almost making it realistic as a person with contours. And then in the bottom right, we can see that these 2 actors are dressed using props and outfits, but the scene behind them is like completely different than what they are. I mean, there's dragons on the wall, and you would never expect that the way that they can use light and the props they're wearing to create this show behind them.
So in order to recreate shadow puppetry, we decided to take the idea of a fable, and we are using The Lion and the Mouse. But we recreated it as an anti-fable, which means it's sort of the opposite of what the original fable was, which you have on your handouts if you want to read it. And we used a story that is very relevant to our community and to many, it still affects many, well, Georgia Tech today. So